Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Today, I was going to discuss shifts in globalization. Specifically, as a part of my series on the Indo-Pacific and China. But instead, all the talk is on the Trump-Putin peace summit in Alaska. So today, I'll recap what has happened in previous peace attempts that we've seen around the Ukraine war, before exploring what happened on Friday at the summit in Alaska. But before diving into the summit in Alaska and even the previous peace attempts, it's worth noting the previous Trump-Putin meeting that occurred in Helsinki back in 2018. During this meeting, we saw Trump and Putin meet privately, and then in the aftermath, Trump sided with Putin over the US intelligence officials on whether Russia meddled in the 2016 presidential campaign. The Russiagate issue has re-emerged in recent months, and Trump continues to side with the Russians against the Democrats. Regardless of the truth of the matter, this highlights how tense US internal politics is today. But this previous meeting also gives us a comparison that we can use when exploring the summit in Alaska on Friday. Back in 2018, Trump was interpreted by many analysts as softening his stance towards Russia during the Helsinki meeting. Have we seen the same issue arise now? I'll get onto that later on in this episode. This summit in Alaska has followed initial peace talks that occurred in Belarus in February of 2022, which were followed by an in-person meeting in Istanbul in March of 2022. These Istanbul negotiations almost resulted in a draft agreement being formed, but they collapsed in mid-April. Multiple reasons were cited for this collapse, including Boris Johnson running to Ukraine to convince Volodymyr Zelensky not to accept the draft agreement. Other reasons that were cited were issues over neutrality and war crimes in Bucha. In July 2022, the Black Sea Grain Initiative secured grain export corridors out of the Black Sea, but this didn't involve a ceasefire or peace treaty between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Since these meetings in 2022, we've seen very little pursuit of peace. Biden threw money, aid and weapons at Ukraine, but he didn't pursue any meetings at the negotiating table. The fact that we're now at the negotiating table, which started with the summit in Alaska, is a promising development. When it comes to any potential peace in the Ukraine war, it's worth recapping what each side wants. Russia and Putin are sticking by the 2022 Istanbul communique. This was repeated in Sergei Lavrov's interview on Tucker Carlson's podcast at the end of 2024. The criteria for this is as follows: permanent Ukrainian neutrality and non-alignment requiring constitutional amendments, security guarantees for Ukraine with Russia listed as a guarantor to assist in the event of aggression, military limitations for Ukraine not being allowed to join NATO, no foreign military bases in Ukraine, the territorial status of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, protections for Russian language rights, and a Crimea negotiation after 10 to 15 years. These Russian criteria were also expanded to include troop withdrawal, ceasefire mechanics, humanitarian corridors, and prisoner exchanges. As we know, we've not yet seen any peace occur, so this criteria wasn't pursued, outside of some prisoner exchanges that we have seen in the last few years as this war has been unfolding. Flipping to the other side, and the Ukrainians and the West saw the Istanbul communique as a capitulation that would place Ukraine in a vulnerable position, unable to protect itself and to determine its own future. The Ukrainians laid out their conditions in the 2022 Ukraine peace formula. This included full Russian withdrawal, the restoration of Ukraine's 1991 borders, justice for war crimes, a security guarantee and potential NATO membership, reparations from Russia for Ukraine's rebuild, no territorial concessions, which would include Crimea, nuclear safety for Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and other nuclear facilities in Ukraine, the security of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, prisoners of war, civilian detainees and child deportees returned, an ecocide investigation into the Kakova Dam destruction, a summit and a treaty being involved in the peace formula, and finally Ukraine being allowed to join the European Union. Now, both of these lists from the Russian and the Ukrainian side are extensive, but we can narrow these lists down to some points where the two sides are on the opposite side of the coin. These are points that are non-negotiables unless either side shifts its stance. The first non-negotiable is that Russia wants the territories of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, whereas Ukraine wants no territorial concessions. The fact that this is written into Russia's constitution, and it's also written in Ukraine's constitution that it can't give up territory without a referendum, this is a massive non-negotiable. The second non-negotiable is NATO membership or the conditions of a security guarantee. Russia wants a limited-sized Ukrainian military and no foreign bases or troops in Ukraine. The current idea is that this security guarantee would be an aerial support security guarantee, but the conditions of this are still yet to be determined. So, if we keep these non-negotiables in mind, let's now move on to the Alaska Summit and whether any of them were addressed or if progress was made to work towards them. So, to reiterate a slight positive that I mentioned earlier, this meeting did show that negotiations are possible. The Russians are willing to sit at the table, which is a necessary prerequisite to even begin to head down a road to peace. Unfortunately, in my opinion, that's where the positives end here. The Trump-Putin meeting brought no actual conclusive treaties or moves towards peace in Ukraine. At first, it seemed that Trump saw it as an opportunity to flex as he flew a B-2 stealth bomber over Putin's head on the runway. But this is where the moments of strength also ended for Trump. Putin landed on American soil in his first trip to a Western country since the start of the Ukraine war. He was given the red carpet treatment, and this visit marks the first time that a Russian president was allowed to visit US military property. Putin was then driven in Trump's limousine, the Beast, for a one-on-one chat. This is typically a move only seen for strong allied leaders. The warrant for Putin's arrest, issued by the International Criminal Court for War Crimes, also still exists, but the United States isn't an active member. Despite this move further erodes the influence that global institutions currently have, and this influence is declining. The meeting between the Russian and the US delegations then commenced. This involved President Trump, Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff from the US side, and then Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov and Ushakov from the Russian delegation. When Lavrov arrived in Russia, it's worth noting that he was sporting a sweater which spelt out USSR in Russian. In the aftermath of the summit, Putin was first to speak in the press conference, despite it being in the United States. He also spoke for more than double the time that Trump did. Trump's speech was brief and lacking in detail, which is notably unusual. So Putin seemed to look incredibly happy in the aftermath of the meeting. He then ignored the reporters' questions, and Trump didn't take any either. Finally, Putin then spoke in English when he asked Trump if he wanted to meet in Moscow next time. So, this is the facts laid out. Sticking to the facts, who came out of this Alaska summit with the shorter straw? Some have described this meeting as a win because Trump got Russia to the table. Some have described this as a Putin manipulation masterclass that will lead to Trump once again pivoting his support to Russia. In sticking with the facts, we don't know what significant agreements were agreed. Trump stated some were made, This could be revealed in the coming days, especially with Zelensky and other European leaders meeting at the White House on Monday. I'll dive into this meeting that occurred with European leaders and Zelensky in next episode, which should be released on Friday. But from the Alaska summit in isolation, what can we conclude? Well, the biggest takeaway, in my opinion, is how Trump ultimately backed down. Trump gave Russia a 50-day ultimatum and threatened massive tariffs and secondary sanctions. Trump said he was going to Alaska for a ceasefire. These were his exact words: "I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire." End quote. Trump also threatened, quote, "severe consequences" if Moscow refused to cooperate. At this moment, before the summit, Trump did seem to be approaching the summit with an idea as to how he could have some leverage and strength in this meeting. However, in the aftermath of this meeting, Trump didn't get a ceasefire, a peace plan, or a joint statement detailing plans or promising agreements. We got none of this. In fact, Trump also pivoted to the Russian narrative that a ceasefire isn't required and that a solution should immediately be reached to end this war. Now, we'll see how this goes in reality, but it's clear who backed down. Putin certainly hasn't, because he's stuck to the points that he's been saying since the war started in 2022. But based on the fact that we didn't get a ceasefire or peace plan, it's clear that Trump clearly did back down. Speaking on why Putin hasn't moved in his stance, the Russians want the root causes of this conflict addressed. They have stood by this stance and reiterated it in Alaska from the 2022 Istanbul communique that we discussed earlier. And the Russians maintaining this stance so strongly is one reason why the non-negotiables that we discussed earlier can't be addressed. The only way that they could be addressed is if the Ukrainians shift stance. This seems to be the pursuit that Trump is now going after. So Trump backs down from his threat of consequences, his hope for a ceasefire, his 50-day ultimatum, which was then shortened to less than 2 weeks, and sanctions against Russia. Trump then said in the Fox News interview after the summit that he wasn't considering sanctions against Russia because the meeting went so well. In fact, Trump referred to the meeting as a 10 out of 10, but there is no actual evidence in the aftermath of this summit that demonstrates that the reality was that this was a 10 out of 10 meeting. Putin made no concessions, and Trump made many. There were no economic incentives that swayed Putin, with the meetings between the economic delegations being scrapped, as well as the planned lunch. The meeting was expected to last 7 hours, and it lasted less than 3. This is yet another unpromising sign. Then, in the aftermath of the summit, Trump spoke of Ukraine and Zelensky. This is when Trump said that there are still 1 or 2 pretty significant items left to solve with Putin, but that they did make good progress. But this isn't the worrying aspect. Trump then stated after this, quote, "Now it's really up to President Zelensky to get it done." This is an absolute gift of a comment for the Russians, who picked it up and ran with it. Former President Medvedev in Russia said this, quote, "Both sides directly place responsibility for achieving future results in negotiations on Kiev and Europe." The first thing when discussing this aspect of the Alaska summit that's clear to me is that, as I stated earlier, the Russians aren't expected to shift or make concessions. This is going to come from the Ukrainian side, according to Russia and Trump. Trump has once again adopted a Putin talking point, whether purposefully or accidentally, and it's played into the Russians' hands, blaming Ukraine and Europe for the continuation of the war. We're now going to see how the ball being placed in Zelensky's hands is going to unfold. This did occur in the meeting on Monday at the White House, but as I stated earlier, this is something that I'll expand on in more detail on Friday. What's clear is that Trump has seesawed since re-entering office between pressuring Russia and pressuring Ukraine. But if this meeting tells us anything, Russia believes that Trump holds no cards or no influence over them because they haven't shifted stance at all. So when Trump does pressure Ukraine, he is massively hurting Europe and Ukraine while playing exactly into Russia's hands. With this meeting, Putin also had the opportunity to peddle the narrative that he and Russia were willing to engage in constructive talks for peace, while Ukraine is the one who is standing in the way of peace. Zelensky stated during the summit that Ukraine will not give their land to the occupier. While this principle stands as moral against Russia, who is an aggressor, it does paint the picture that Zelensky and Ukraine aren't willing to negotiate. In short, Putin is attempting to rewrite the narrative, and Trump backing off seems to imply that Putin had some success in doing this. This is leading to Russia wanting to transform slow, grinding battlefield gains into political leverage. Trump has backed down, and Putin has stuck to the points that he's been relaying for years. If Putin gets his way, he will expand Russia's sphere of influence and leave Ukraine vulnerable. Even without Russian military action, Russia could slowly exert more influence over Ukraine. It's difficult to find any aspects of this summit where Trump and the United States emerged looking strong, but I'm willing to let this entire process pan out, including the talks with European leaders that occurred on Monday and any future potential meetings. I'm also willing to be convinced otherwise of my pessimistic view of this summit. As I've stated, I will discuss the meeting at the White House with European leaders and Zelensky that occurred on Monday in the next episode. This should come out on Friday. That's all for today. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave a review on the podcast platform of your choice? I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.